There are two kinds of true crime stories: the ones that begin with chaos, and the ones that begin with nothing at all. This one begins on a perfectly ordinary street, in a perfectly ordinary neighborhood, with a perfectly ordinary house. No police tape, no noise, no neighbors watching, just a quiet home, and a life that, from the outside, looked completely normal. Inside that house lived a woman named Melissa. She had a job, a routine, responsibilities. People who knew her described her as quiet, reserved, private, not dangerous, not unstable, not someone you would ever expect to see on the news. And that's what makes this story so disturbing. Because this is not a story about a monster, it's a story about a slow collapse. Over the next few hours, that quiet house would become the center of an investigation that would leave detectives asking a terrifying question. How long had this been building without anyone noticing? At first, the story seemed simple, too simple, an explanation that almost made sense. Almost. But as investigators would soon discover, simple stories don't need to be edited. And this one kept changing. Phone records, timelines, small inconsistencies, tiny details that didn't matter, until they did, until someone finally stepped back and looked at the whole picture. And when they did, they realized something chilling. This wasn't a moment, it was a process. This case wouldn't be solved by a single clue. It would be solved by time, by patience, by watching how a story slowly falls apart when it's built on something that isn't true. And by the end of this investigation, one truth would become impossible to ignore. The most dangerous breaking points are the ones that happen quietly. This is not a story about what happened in one day. This is a story about everything that led up to it. The pressure, the silence, the choices, the turning point no one saw coming. This is the story of how a normal life slowly became something else, and how, once it did, there was no way back. From the outside, the house on Ridgeway Lane looked like every other house on the street. Same pale paint, same narrow driveway, same small front porch with a light that stayed on a little too long at night. Nothing about it suggested that anything unusual had ever happened there. And that's usually how these stories begin. Not with noise, not with warning, but with a place that looks so ordinary that no one ever thinks to question it. People drove past that house every day. They walked their dogs past it. They waved at it. They never stopped to look at it. Inside that house lived Melissa Carter, a single mother, an office worker, a woman most people described as quiet, reliable, and strong. But strength in Melissa's life didn't mean healthy. It meant silent. It meant controlled. It meant carrying everything alone. Melissa did not grow up in a home where emotions were discussed. In her family, problems were not something you talked about. They were something you endured. Her parents believed in discipline, in keeping things together, in not letting the outside world see what was happening inside the house. If something hurt, you didn't cry about it. If something scared you, you didn't talk about it. And if something felt too heavy to carry, you carried it anyway. Melissa learned these rules early. She became the kind of child teachers never worried about, the kind who did her work quietly, the kind who never caused trouble, the kind who always seemed fine. But fine was something she learned to perform, not something she learned to feel. When she was sad, she stayed quiet. When she was overwhelmed, she worked harder. When she needed help, she convinced herself she didn't. And over time, this stopped being something she did. It became who she was. As she grew older, Melissa built her entire identity around one idea. Do not fail. Not at school. Not at work. Not in relationships. Not in life. She married young. She wanted a normal life. A stable life. A life that looked right from the outside. And for a while, she had it. A home. A routine. Children. From a distance, it looked like she had done everything correctly. But the marriage was never easy. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was quiet. Distant. built more on responsibility than closeness. They didn't fight much. They also didn't really talk much. They lived side by side, not together. And when it ended, it didn't explode. There were no scenes, no shouting, no moment that felt like a clear ending. It just slowly fell apart. And when it did, Melissa was left standing in the middle of a life she suddenly had to hold up alone. The divorce didn't just change her relationship, it changed the structure of her entire life. Suddenly, every responsibility was hers. The children, the bills, the house, the job, the schedule, the emergencies, the future, and hanging over all of it, the fear of losing the house, the fear of losing her job, the fear of not being enough, the fear of failing. And in Melissa's mind, failure was not an option, not because it would be hard, but because it would mean she was exactly what she had spent her whole life trying not to be, someone who couldn't hold it together. Her days became carefully measured. Every expense was calculated. Every hour was accounted for. There was no room for mistakes, no room for rest, no room for weakness. She woke up early, went to work, came home, took care of everything, and then stayed up late, trying to plan her way out of a future that felt like it was shrinking. She told herself it was temporary. She just needed to get through this month, then the next, then the next. But the pressure never went away. It only changed shape. Little things started disappearing from her life. First, social plans, then phone calls, then weekends that felt like weekends. She stopped seeing friends, stopped visiting family, not because she didn't care, but because everything felt like energy she couldn't afford to spend. Even rest started to feel dangerous, because rest meant time to think, and thinking meant noticing how tired she really was. At night, the house was very quiet, sometimes too quiet. Melissa would sit at the kitchen table long after the lights should have been off, looking at nothing, thinking about everything, replaying conversations, replaying mistakes, replaying imaginary futures where something went wrong, and in every version of that future, everything collapsed. From the outside, nothing looked wrong. The house was still there. The children still went to school. She still went to work. But inside, something was tightening. Slowly, day by day, a pressure that never released, a fear that never slept, a life that had become a narrow hallway with no doors. And the most dangerous part, Melissa didn't think she was breaking. She thought she was surviving. She thought this was what strength looked like. She thought this was just what life was. But some people don't fall apart loudly. They fall apart quietly, in ways that are easy to miss, in ways that look like responsibility, in ways that look like endurance, in ways that look normal. And that's how the house on Ridgeway Lane stayed quiet. That's how no one noticed how much weight was building inside one person. That's how life can look completely ordinary, right up until the moment it isn't. People around Melissa Carter noticed subtle changes first. Small things. At first, you could almost overlook them. Her sister Rachel had called that week. She asked how Melissa was doing, and for the first time, Melissa's voice didn't sound like herself. Not sad, not angry, just distant. I don't know how to get through the next few days, she said. Rachel had shrugged it off at the time. Stress, she thought. Divorce stress, work stress, life stress. But even in that moment, Rachel had a quiet, lingering feeling. Something wasn't right. At work, it was similar. Melissa's co-worker, Janet, noticed the changes too. She stopped joining the small office lunches, stopped chatting by the coffee machine, even stopped attending the occasional casual after-work drinks. She wasn't avoiding people maliciously. She just stopped. Her focus was inward, inward, inward. No one knew it yet, but her behavior was starting to signal that the pressure Melissa carried was no longer manageable. And then there were the words. Those strange, final-sounding sentences. I just need to get through the next few days. I'll deal with it tomorrow, or the day after. I just need to finish this week. These weren't normal phrases from someone under stress. They were a countdown in her mind, a way of marking time that something was about to break. Even the children's teacher noticed it in the kids. They were quieter than usual, not restless, not withdrawn in the typical way, just quieter, like something had shifted in the household that wasn't visible but could be felt. Some people might have seen these signs and acted. Some might have even asked questions. But most people just moved on with their day. Life in a quiet suburb keeps moving, even when someone is falling apart inside. And then came the night before the tragedy. The house was unusually dark, except for the kitchen light, which burned too long into the night. Melissa sat at the table, alone, thinking, replaying events, running conversations in her head, imagining outcomes. She did not sleep well, not because she was restless, but because her mind refused to stop calculating. At one point, she called her sister. It was a short call. They spoke in soft, careful tones. Then, before hanging up, Melissa said something that would echo later in the investigation. Do you ever feel like you're about to fail so badly? There's no fixing it? Rachel didn't respond immediately. She didn't know what to say. She thought it was stress. She thought a good night's sleep would help. She didn't know that it was already too late. Detective Daniel Harris arrived on the scene that morning. Harris had been on the force for over 20 years. He had seen countless scenes that seemed ordinary at first. He had learned one thing that never failed. People who tell the truth don't try to manage their story. Melissa was managing hers. Every detail she provided seemed rehearsed. Every sentence had a careful weight to it. Small inconsistencies appeared almost immediately. Nothing huge, but enough to raise suspicion. Harris noticed her hands, her movements, even the way she answered questions. Not defensive, not emotional, calculating, the kind of calm that comes not from shock, but from someone trying to make their version of events believable. And that's when the investigation truly began. Not with dramatic evidence, not with outbursts, not with frantic calls, but with careful observation. The detective's first step was simple. He listened, he documented, he began constructing a timeline minute by minute. Every phone call, every small action, every interaction, even the things no one thought were important at first. Because in cases like this, the smallest detail can change everything. And while the timeline was being pieced together, Melissa continued her day. From the outside, nothing seemed unusual. From the outside, she was still the reliable, quiet mother. But inside, the pressure she had been carrying for years, the weight she had learned to bear in silence, was now visible in the small cracks of her story. Those cracks would grow, and they would eventually become the framework of the investigation. By the end of that day, Detective Harris and his team had learned something important. This wasn't about a single moment of panic. This wasn't about one mistake. This was about days of thought, behavior, and decisions that led to that morning. And now, they had to uncover exactly what had been happening before it was too late for understanding the truth. When you think about investigations, you often imagine flashing lights, shouting, or high-speed chases. But most of the time, the real work is quiet, methodical, and invisible to the outside world. It begins not with drama, but with a timeline. And for Detective Daniel Harris and his team, that morning marked the first careful step into a world that didn't yet make sense. Melissa's story didn't match itself, not in big ways, in small, almost imperceptible ways. A sentence here, a word choice there, an event out of sequence. Each one seemed insignificant alone, but Harris had learned over decades. Small cracks eventually become the whole picture. So the first task was simple. Listen. Take every word, every action, every reported detail, and lay it out on the evidence board, piece by piece, timeline by timeline. The board grew quickly. Pins, strings, sticky notes, photos of phone screens, receipts, schedules. Every timestamp became a thread. Every thread revealed another question. Why did a call happen at 8:12 a.m. when Melissa had claimed to be asleep? Why did a note get deleted just minutes before she reported the incident? Why did small, seemingly irrelevant details like a trip to the grocery store contradict statements she had made hours earlier? The board didn't lie. The board didn't argue. It simply showed the story that had actually happened, and Melissa's story wasn't matching it. Investigators turned to the quiet, invisible evidence: digital footprints, search histories, deleted notes, location logs, not the content itself, not explicit words or phrases, just behavior, patterns, actions across multiple days. And what they found was clear. This was not panic. This was preparation. Some investigators might have been tempted to rush, to confront her immediately, but Harris knew better. He knew the danger wasn't in waiting. It was in misreading the story. So they let the timeline speak, let the board speak, let the small inconsistencies pile up until the larger truth emerged. Meanwhile, Melissa's story continued to shift. Not dramatically, not in a way that seemed obvious, but every new version she gave created a new gap, a new inconsistency, a new question. And Harris' team documented it all. Every conversation, every statement, every hesitation. Because over time, patterns reveal themselves, and in this case, the pattern was unmistakable. Melissa wasn't forgetting. She wasn't confused. She was editing. The timeline revealed other things too: strange phone activity late at night, sudden deletions of digital messages, unusual interactions with the children that no one had noticed at the time. Each detail alone could be dismissed, but the sum told a story no one could ignore. Harris called it the accumulation effect. One detail might be explainable, 2 might be coincidence, 3 becomes a pattern, 10 or 20. That is no longer coincidence. That is evidence. As the hours turned into days, investigators could see a clear mental map of Melissa's actions, a blueprint, not drawn by anyone else, not chaotic, but deliberate. Small decisions stacked upon small decisions, a quiet, invisible preparation that only became visible once the pieces were aligned. And the pieces, they didn't lie. Witness interviews began to add context to the timeline. The sister remembered short calls with strange phrases. The coworker remembered subtle changes in routine. The teacher remembered a quiet shift in the children's demeanor. The neighbors recalled unusual nighttime activity. All these threads were pinned to the board. All these threads were connected with string, sticky notes, and careful observation. All these threads began to paint a picture that contradicted Melissa's carefully managed story. By this stage, Harris and his team were no longer just investigating what had happened. They were investigating why it had happened. The timeline wasn't just evidence. It was insight. Insight into thought patterns. Insight into stress. Insight into fear, control, and pressure. And as the timeline grew, the narrative became chillingly clear. This wasn't a sudden collapse. It wasn't an accident. It had been building day by day for a long time. Harris would later reflect. When you look at the evidence laid out like this, the story tells itself. People think they can manipulate the timeline, but time leaves traces. It doesn't lie. And it was true. Every action, every call, every deleted note, every discrepancy in her story, they were traces left behind. Evidence of control, manipulation, and planning, not by someone acting in panic, but by someone trying to make the world believe their version of reality, even if it wasn't true. By the time the team had finished reconstructing the timeline, they had something powerful: a map of events, behavior, and intention, a clear understanding of what had been done, when, and in what order. And while it still didn't tell the whole story of why Melissa had done what she did, it showed the truth of her decisions, one pin at a time. The timeline had done more than just show evidence. It had revealed a mind under pressure, a mind making choices, and a mind calculating outcomes. And for Detective Harris, that was the moment he realized this case wasn't just about what happened in a few hours. It was about what had been happening over days, weeks, even months. and that's what makes it so tragic. By the time investigators entered the next phase of the case, not from a confession, not from a sudden revelation, but from the accumulation of details that no one could ignore. Every statement Melissa had made, every phone record, every witness recollection, every timestamp, they weren't just pieces of evidence, they were threads, and the investigators were beginning to weave them together. Detective Harris called it the net. When you pull on one small thread in these cases, it touches another, and then another, and eventually, it becomes impossible to escape. The first threads came from people who knew Melissa best. Her sister, Rachel, was called back in for a longer interview. Did she ever say things that worried you? Sometimes, Rachel said. Short calls, things that sounded odd. Words like, I can't manage this, or I just need to get through this. I didn't think much of it at the time. On their own, these statements were just expressions of stress. But alongside the timeline, alongside deleted notes, alongside small contradictions in her story, they began to gain weight. Co-workers were next. Janet, the office colleague who had noticed Melissa's isolation, described patterns in her behavior: skipping lunches, avoiding conversations, appearing distant, staying late at the office again. Nothing dramatic, nothing criminal, but these were patterns of a mind under extreme pressure, acting in ways no one outside could see except investigators, who laid the pieces side by side. The teachers, the neighbors, even casual acquaintances were interviewed. Each detail seemed minor, almost irrelevant. But Harris and his team did what good investigators always do. They never dismiss patterns. And then the timeline and the witness accounts began to intersect. Small contradictions became impossible contradictions. Minutes didn't align, phone calls didn't align, stories didn't align, and slowly, the investigators began to see the story Melissa had been trying to tell herself, a story she wanted others to believe, a story that didn't match reality. At this point, the investigation shifted focus. Melissa herself. The officers no longer just observed, they prepared for the one step that would bring the net together: the arrest. Arresting someone like Melissa required care. She wasn't violent, she wasn't resisting, she was methodical, controlled, calm. Everything about her demeanor suggested that a sudden move could push her into careful deception, not panic. On the day of the arrest, the team moved quietly. They approached the house on Ridgeway Lane with precision. No drama, no lights flashing, just steady, controlled action. Melissa was aware of their presence. And yet, she didn't flee. She didn't panic. She simply asked one question, quietly, almost to herself. Do they hate me? Her calm was unnerving. It was the same calm she had shown to Detective Harris on the first day. The same calm that investigators had been trying to decode. After the arrest, the next step was preparation for trial. Here, the tension shifted from observation to anticipation. The team meticulously compiled their evidence. Files stacked on tables, notes pinned to walls, timelines refined again and again. Every inconsistency recorded, every deviation documented. The net was now ready to close. Meanwhile, Melissa's public life had not changed much. Neighbors still saw her walking the dog, driving to work. Children were at school. The house remained the same quiet shell it had always been. But behind closed doors, the investigators worked tirelessly. Hours, days, weeks of painstaking effort, aligning witness testimony with timelines, aligning physical and digital evidence, ensuring no gaps remained. This is the work that doesn't make headlines. The work that defines true investigative rigor. Harris reflected on the stage of the investigation. By this point, you're no longer guessing. You're not hoping. You're following the evidence. Each piece tells you more than the last. And in cases like this, the evidence never lies. Witness statements, digital timelines, and observational notes all converged into a single conclusion. Melissa's story could no longer hold. It had been carefully constructed, rehearsed, edited. but even the most precise edits leave traces, and for the investigators, the traces were enough. The net, once loose and scattered, was now taut, unyielding, inescapable. And as the pre-trial preparations moved forward, it became clear the courtroom would soon be the stage where the net tightened completely, where every thread, every inconsistency, every small detail would be visible to everyone, where the truth, finally, could no longer hide. Courtrooms don't feel like the movies. There's no background music, no dramatic lighting, no grand speeches echoing through the room. There is only silence, broken by footsteps, paper, and the quiet weight of decisions that cannot be undone. By the time Melissa's trial began, the story had already been built, not as a narrative, not as a theory, but as a structure of dates, times, actions, and contradictions. The courtroom was simply where that structure would be tested. On the first morning, the room filled slowly. Jurors took their seats, lawyers arranged their files, the judge reviewed notes, and Melissa sat quietly beside her defense team. She looked ordinary, not like the person the headlines described, not like the person at the center of months of investigation, just someone sitting in a chair waiting, and that, more than anything else, made the room feel heavier. The prosecution began the way strong cases always do, not with emotion, but with order. They told the jury, "This is not a case about confusion. This is not a case about panic. This is a case about decisions." They explained that they would not ask the jury to imagine anything. They would simply show them the timeline. The timeline came first. Large boards were brought in, printed pages, phone records, work schedules, digital logs. One by one, the prosecution walked the jury through days, then hours, then minutes. Not what someone said happened, but what the data showed happened. And slowly, the same pattern Detective Harris had seen began to emerge in the courtroom. Gaps, edits, moments that didn't align. Then came the witnesses, not dramatic ones, not emotional performances, just people who had known Melissa, her sister, her coworker, a teacher, a neighbor. Each one told small, simple stories, short phone calls, strange comments, changes in routine, things that didn't seem important at the time, but when placed into the timeline, they mattered. The defense tried to paint a different picture. They talked about stress, pressure, emotional exhaustion. They argued that Melissa had been overwhelmed, that her life had collapsed under weight no one could see. And in that, they weren't entirely wrong. The court did not deny that her life had been difficult, but the prosecution returned again and again to one point: stress explains emotions. It does not explain planning. Sentencing days are never loud. There are no arguments left, no evidence left to present, no story left to reshape, only consequences. Melissa stood before the court one last time, not as a suspect, not as a defendant, but as someone whose choices had already been judged. The judge spoke calmly, about responsibility, about actions, about how the court cannot change the past, only acknowledge it. And then the sentence was given, not as a moment of drama, but as a final period at the end of a very long, very painful sentence. There was no celebration in the courtroom, no feeling of victory, because no one truly wins in cases like this. There is only an ending. Outside, the world kept moving. Cars passed, people went to work, neighbors walked their dogs, and on Ridgeway Lane, the house still stood, exactly the same walls, same windows, same door, but everything inside it was different. The rooms were quiet, not the peaceful kind of quiet, the kind of quiet that feels unfinished, the kind that reminds you that something used to be here, and now it isn't. Investigators would later say that this is the part of the job they never get used to, the part after the case is closed, after the files are archived, after the courtroom lights are turned off, when you drive past the place where everything happened, and it's just a house again. Detective Harris returned to his normal work. New cases, new files, new stories, but this one stayed with him, not because of how it ended, but because of how long it had been building without anyone seeing it. He would later say, "Most people think tragedies announce themselves. They don't. They arrive quietly, slowly, disguised as normal life." Melissa's story didn't begin with a crime. It began with pressure, with isolation, with a life that slowly became smaller, with problems that were never truly spoken out loud, with a mind that started to believe there was no way forward. And this is the part that makes the story uncomfortable, because nothing about her life looked extraordinary. No warning signs that screamed for attention, just the kind of quiet struggle that exists in millions of homes. But this story is not here to create excuses. It's here to show where silence, untreated stress, and disconnection can lead when they are ignored for too long. It's here to show that choices still matter, even under pressure, especially under pressure. The children's names were spoken less and less in the media as time passed, but their absence remained. In the empty rooms, in the unused toys, in the quiet mornings. The house was eventually sold. New people moved in. They painted the walls. They opened the curtains. They tried to make it feel like a home again. But some places, they remember, this case would be studied in psychology courses, in law enforcement training, in discussions about stress, isolation, and warning signs. Not because it was shocking, but because it was quiet. Because it didn't look like a tragedy until it already was one. And that is the most unsettling part of all. In the end, this story is not just about a trial, or an investigation, or a verdict. It's about a turning point that no one recognized until it was too late. And it leaves us with a question that has no easy answer. How many lives around us are quietly breaking, without anyone noticing? The house on Ridgeway Lane still stands. The street is still quiet. And somewhere, a clock is still ticking.